"Have a very poor head for heights," said John. "That one," said Virtue, pointing to a narrow strip of greenery 1,000 feet below them. "I could never reach it." "Oh, you could reach that easily enough. The difficulty is to know what happens beyond it. I'm inclined to think that it overhangs, and though we could get down to it, I'm not sure that we could get back if the rest of the descent was impracticable." "Then it would be madness to trust ourselves so far." "I don't know about that. It would be in accordance with the rule." "What rule?" "The rule is," said Virtue, "that if we have one chance out of 100 of surviving, we must attempt it. But if we have none, absolutely none, then it would be self-destruction, and we need not." "It is no rule of mine," said John. "But it is. We all have the same set of rules, really, you know." "If it is a rule of mine, it is one that I cannot obey." "I don't think I understand you," said Virtue. "But of course you may be such a bad climber that you wouldn't have even one chance. That would make a difference, I allow." Then a third voice spoke. "You have neither of you any chance at all unless I carry you down." Both the young men turned at the sound. An old woman was seated in a kind of rocky chair at the very edge of the precipice. "Oh, it's you, Mother Kirk, is it?" said Virtue, and added in an undertone to John, "I've seen her about the cliffs more than once. Some of the country people say she is second-sighted, and some that she is crazy." "I shouldn't trust her," said John in the same tone. "She looks to me much more like a witch." Then he turned to the old woman and said aloud, "And how could you carry us down, Mother? We would be more fit to carry you." "I could do it, though," said Mother Kirk, "by the power that the landlord has given me." "So you believe in the landlord too?" said John. "How can I not, dear?" said she, "when I am his own daughter-in-law." "He does not give you very fine clothes," said John, glancing at the old woman's country cloak. "They'll last my time," said the old woman placidly. "We ought to try her," whispered Virtue to John. "As long as there is any chance, we are not allowed to neglect it." But John frowned at him to be silent, and addressed the old woman again. "Do you not think this landlord of yours is a very strange one?" he said. "How so?" said she. "Why does he make a road like this, running up to the very edge of a precipice, unless it is to encourage travellers to break their necks in the dark?" "Oh, bless you, he never left it like that," said the old woman. "It was a good road all round the world when it was new, and all this gorge is far later than the road." "You mean," said Virtue, "that there has been some sort of catastrophe?" "Well," said Mother Kirk, "I see there will be no getting you down tonight, so I may as well tell you the story. Come and sit down by me. You are neither of you so wise that you need be ashamed of listening to an old wives' tale." 2. Mother Kirk's Story. When they were seated, the old woman told the following story. "You must know that once upon a time there were no tenants in this country at all, for the landlord used to farm it himself. There were only the animals, and the landlord used to look after them, he and his sons and daughters. Every morning they used to come down from the mountains and milk the cows and lead out the sheep to pasture, and they needed less watching, for all the animals were tamer then, and there were no fences needed, for if a wolf got in among the flocks he would do them no harm. And one day the landlord was going home from his day's work when he looked round on the country and the beasts and saw how the crops were springing, and it came into his head that the whole thing was too good to keep to himself. So he decided to let the country to tenants, and his first tenant was a young married man. But first the landlord made a farm in the very centre of the land where the soil was the best and the air most wholesome, and that was the very spot where you are sitting now. They were to have the whole land, but that was too much for them to keep under cultivation. The landlord's idea was that they could work the farm and leave the rest as a park for the time being. But later they could divide the park up into holdings for their children, for you must know that he drew up a very different lease from the kind you have nowadays. It was a lease in perpetuity on his side, for he promised never to turn them out, but on their side they could leave when they chose, as long as one of their sons was there to take the farm on, and then they could go up to live with him in the mountains. He thought that would be a good thing, because it would broaden the minds of his own mountain children to mix with strangers, and they thought so too. But before he put the tenants in possession, there was one thing he had to do. Up to this time the country had been full of a certain fruit which the landlord had planted for the refreshment of himself and his children, if they were thirsty during the day as they worked down here. It was a very good fruit, and up in the mountains they say it is even more plentiful, but it is very strong, and only those who are mountain-bred ought to eat it, for only they can digest it properly. Hitherto, while there were only beasts in the land, it had done no harm for these mountain apples to be growing in every thicket, for you know that an animal will eat nothing but what is good for it. But now that there were to be men in the land, the landlord was afraid that they might do themselves an injury. Yet it was not to be thought of that he should dig up every sapling of that tree and make the country into a desert. So he decided that it was best to be frank with the young people, and when he found a great big mountain apple tree growing in the very centre of the farm, he said, "So much the better. If they are to learn sense, they may as well learn it from the beginning, and if they will not, there's no help for it. For if they did not find mountain apples on the farm, they would soon find them somewhere else." So he left the apple tree standing and put the man and his wife into their farm. But before he left them, he explained the whole affair to them, as much of it could be explained, and warned them on no account to eat any of the apples. Then he went home, and for a time the young man and his wife behaved very well, tending the animals and managing their farm and abstaining from the mountain apples. And for all I know, they might never have done otherwise if the wife had not somehow made a new acquaintance. This new acquaintance was a landowner himself. He had been born in the mountains and was one of our landlord's own children, but he had quarrelled with his father and set up on his own, and now had built up a very considerable estate in another country. His estate marches, however, with this country, and as he was a great land-grabber, he always wanted to take this bit in, and he has very nearly succeeded. "I've never met any tenants of his," said John. "Not tenants-in-chief, my dear," said the old woman, "and so you didn't know them. But you may have met the Clevers, who are tenants of Mr. Mammon, and he is a tenant of the Spirit of the Age, who holds directly of the enemy." "I am sure the Clevers would be very surprised," said John, "to hear that they had a landlord at all. They would think this enemy, as you call him, no less a superstition than your landlord." "But this is how business is managed," said Mother Kirk. "The little people do not know the big people to whom they belong. The big people do not intend that they should. No important transference of property could be carried out if all the small people at the bottom knew what was really happening. But this is not part of my story. As I was saying, the enemy got to know the farmer's wife, and however he did it, or whatever he said to her, it wasn't long before he persuaded her that the one thing she needed was a nice mountain apple, and she took one and ate it. And then, you know how it is with husbands, she made the farmer come round to her mind, and at the moment he put out his hand and plucked the fruit, there was an earthquake, and the country cracked open all the way across from north to south, and ever since, instead of the farm, there has been this gorge, which the country people call the Grand Canyon, but in my language its name is Peccatum Adei. 3. The self-sufficiency of virtue. "And I suppose," said John sourly, "the landlord was so annoyed that it was he who invented the rules and the black hole." "The story is not quite so simple as that," said the old woman. "So many things happened after the eating of the apple. For one thing, the taste created such a craving in the man and the woman that they thought they could never eat enough of it, and they were not content with all the wild apple trees, but planted more and more, and grafted mountain apple onto every other kind of tree, so that every fruit should have a dash of that taste in it. They succeeded so well that the whole vegetable system of the country is now infected, and there is hardly a fruit or a root in the land, certainly none this side of the canyon, that has not a little mountain apple in it. You have never tasted anything that was quite free from it." "And what has that got to do with the card of rules?" said John. "Everything," said Mother Kirk. "In a country where all the food is more or less poisoned, but some of it very much less than more, You need very complicated rules indeed to keep healthy.